Daniel Dillon, The Calculus of Betrayal, written by Tane Blackadder, read by Arthur Howard. The rain on the diner window wasn't falling. It was weeping. Long, slow, greasy tears that bled down the glass, each droplet capturing a sliver of the flickering neon sign from across the street and stretching it into a lurid, bleeding wound of light. This was no cleansing shower. It was the city's own slow exhalation of filth, a seepage that promised to leave a residue on everything it touched, the kind of weather that made you feel the accumulated grime of decades deep in your bones. Across the table, Daniel was a statue in the gloom, his hands cupped around his chipped ceramic mug. He wasn't stirring the black coffee, hadn't for 10 minutes. He was just staring into its depths, his gaze so utterly still and focused, it seemed he was trying to peer through the dark, oily surface as if it were a scrying pool, one that stubbornly, maliciously refused to show him anything good, offering only a distorted reflection of his own hollowed features. The silence between us was our old companion, a familiar presence forged in the long, painful months after his family was taken. But tonight, the silence felt different. It had a new texture, a new weight. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of shared grief we knew so well. It was the electric, pregnant silence of the calm before a storm. It was a held breath, a watchful pause. We could both feel it building, a pressure drop in the atmosphere of our small booth, a charge gathering in the damp air that smelled of stale coffee and wet wool. Something was coming, riding in on the weeping rain, and the quiet was simply the world waiting for it to arrive. The bell above the door chimed, a weak, tinny sound that was almost devoured by the low, drumming symphony of the rain on the diner's roof. It was the kind of apologetic noise a relic makes, a ghost of a greeting from a brighter past. And then he entered, a man who didn't just step through the door but seemed to be violently deposited by the storm itself. He brought the tempest in with him, not in the water that dripped from his sensible jacket, though it was dark with moisture, but in the chaotic energy that crackled around him. He wasn't wet from the rain. He was drenched from the inside out, as if some internal dam had burst, flooding his system with a pure, unadulterated terror that made his hands tremble and his breath catch in shallow, ragged hitches. This panic was so profound it seemed to radiate from him in visible waves, distorting the air around him like heat haze, an aura of sheer desperation that made the hair on my arms stand on end. He was a man completely unmoored, cut loose from the safe harbor of his own life, and now tossed on a sea of unimaginable fear. His eyes, wide and shot through with a web of crimson, scanned the near-empty diner with a wild, frantic energy, skipping over Mel's stoic back, over the empty vinyl booths, until their desperate search finally crashed to a halt. They landed on us, on the shadowed figures in the back booth, but they didn't settle on me. They fixed, with the terrifying force of a final failing hope, squarely on Daniel. In that look was a silent, screaming plea, an entire world collapsing, and the desperate belief that the grim, silent man in the shadows was the only one who could possibly hold up the ruins. He looked like an everyday man, the kind of guy you'd instinctively trust to coach a kid's softball team, the sort of face you'd see smiling from a family holiday card, all reliable warmth and uncomplicated joy. He had that solid, dependable build of a man who might spend his Saturdays patiently struggling with a bulky charcoal grill, a cold beer in hand, laughing at his own mistakes. But that man was gone, erased. In his place was this haunted figure, mid-40s but suddenly aged, his once kind face now carved deep with new lines of terror, each groove a stark contour map of his sudden devastation. He wore a sensible beige windbreaker, the kind chosen for practicality over style, but it was buttoned wrong, one side dragging lower than the other, a small, telling detail of a world knocked completely off its axis. This simple sartorial failure was more telling than any scream. It was the portrait of a man who had gotten dressed in the eye of his own hurricane. He moved toward our booth, not with purpose, but with the lurching, unstable gait of a ship taking on water, listing badly. Each step was a struggle against an invisible, overwhelming force, his body swaying as if the linoleum floor had become a storm-tossed deck. He was going down, and his entire being was focused on the Herculean effort of simply remaining upright, long enough to reach the fragile lifeline of our table. "Daniel Dillon?" he asked, his voice a frayed wire, thin and buzzing with a current of pure desperation. It was a sound that seemed to tear itself from a place deep within his chest, stripped of all resonance, leaving only the raw, exposed core of a question he was almost too afraid to have answered. The name hung in the greasy air between us, a fragile lifeline thrown across the chasm of his despair. Daniel didn't nod. He didn't offer a hand or a word of greeting. He just looked up from his coffee, a slow, deliberate motion that was more impactful than any spoken welcome. His eyes, dark and impossibly weary, lifted and held the man's frantic gaze. That look was enough. It was a silent, gravitational pull, an unspoken command to unburden himself. It was both an invitation to sit and an instantaneous, penetrating assessment, a veteran cop's swift and brutal inventory of a person in crisis, taking in the wrong-buttoned jacket, the tremor in the hands, the utter collapse of a spirit. "My name is Ben Sanderson," the man gasped, the words tumbling out as if the act of identification was itself a monumental effort. And with that, the last of his strength seemed to leave him. He collapsed into the booth opposite us without being asked, his body folding into the cracked vinyl. The movement displaced the air, carrying with it the scent of the city's night rain, a metallic, clean smell undercut by the sour, acrid odor of cold sweat, the intimate and pungent aroma of sheer, unadulterated terror. He drew a shuddering breath, a sound that rattled in the quiet diner, and then he uttered the words that changed everything. "My wife. Sarah, she's gone." The sentence landed in the center of the table with the weight of a tombstone, final and absolute. The story spilled out of him in a choked, broken rush, each word a piece of shrapnel torn from the core of his being. Sarah Sanderson. The name was an anchor, the only solid thing left in his dissolving world. A dedicated nurse at St. Ignatius, the city's oldest and by many accounts most overburdened and crumbling hospital. A truly good woman, he insisted, his voice cracking with a love that was now a source of agony. The kind who still believed in the job, who saw it as a calling rather than a burden. Her routine was a testament to her character. She'd worked the late shift, and without fail she took the 10:22 commuter train home every single night. But last night, the universe had skipped a beat. She never got off. The train reached its terminus emptied, and there, left behind on the worn fabric of the seat, was her purse. It was found by a cleaner, its contents spilling out onto the floor. Her phone was inside, its screen dark and silent. There were no signs of a struggle, no torn fabric, no dropped earring, nothing. Just gone. Vanished into thin air from a sealed metal tube, hurtling through the darkness. A phantom disappearance witnessed by a carriage full of people who, somehow, had seen absolutely nothing. The police, Ben Sanderson said, his hands working relentlessly, twisting a paper napkin into a shredded, fibrous confession of his helplessness. They say she probably just left. The words were ash in his mouth. That maybe she was stressed from the hospital. That she needed space. That she'll turn up in a day or two, embarrassed and sorry. The look on his face was a raw, open wound, an expression of such profound disbelief and betrayal that it was difficult to hold his gaze. It was the face of a man whose entire understanding of justice and order had been dismantled in a single, brutal conversation with an overworked detective. But she wouldn't. Not Sarah. His voice, which had been a reedy whisper, found a core of steel, an absolute certainty that was the last bastion of his sanity. "You have to understand. She texts me when she's 5 minutes late from the grocery store. She has a calendar alert for watering her orchid every Tuesday at 7 p.m. She wouldn't just leave. He was pleading now, invoking the tiny sacred liturgies of a shared life, the small tender rituals that build a world for two and prove someone's presence in it. He was using the same simple, devastating proofs that Ilara Cruz had once offered. The ferns, the orchid, the mundane, beautiful evidence of a person who is anchored, of a life that is cared for. Daniel listened, his face a granite mask, but his eyes were alive, absorbing every tremor in the man's voice, every unconscious gesture. He asked the necessary, brutal questions in that low, calm, almost therapeutic voice, a tool to deconstruct the emotional chaos and build a framework of facts. Their marriage? Fine, good even, Ben insisted, and the answer came too quickly, a well-rehearsed line that lacked the texture of truth. Any debts? A mortgage like everyone else. Car payments? Nothing out of the ordinary. The answer was clean, sanitized. Anyone new in her life? Not that she mentioned. Not that I knew of. The repetition was a tell, a verbal stumble. Had she been acting strangely, worried? Here Ben's eyes flickered down to the ruined napkin in his hands. A fraction of a second of hesitation. A tiny crack in the dam of his performance. The hospital. It's a tough place. She'd been quiet lately. But she always internalized it. Said it was her job to be strong for the patients. It was an answer that sounded true, but it was also a deliberate redirect. A carefully placed stone to block a path of inquiry he desperately wanted to keep closed. Here Ben hesitated. A fraction of a second that stretched, in the tense silence of the booth, into a small eternity. It was a microscopic flicker in his bloodshot eyes, a brief but definite retreat from the raw, open anguish that had defined him moments before. It was as if a shadow passed behind his gaze, a quick internal calculation performed behind the curtain of his performance. She'd been tired lately, he offered, the words coming slower now, more measured. The hospital's a tough place. It wears on you. He drew a breath, a deliberate pause that felt less like a struggle for composure and more like a strategic placement of a chess piece. She said she'd seen some things that bothered her, recently. He leaned forward slightly, a gesture meant to convey confidentiality, but which instead felt staged. But she wouldn't talk about it. Not even to me. Patient confidentiality, she said. She took that part of the job so seriously. He finished with a weak, helpless shrug, attempting to paint her professionalism as the final, frustrating barrier. It was the slightest of tells, a hairline fracture, in the otherwise seamless portrait of a distraught husband. A man truly drowning in genuine panicked grief wouldn't have hesitated. He'd have lunged at any detail, any scrap of information, no matter how small or vague, and thrust it toward us as if it were a vital clue. His story would have been a torrent, not a trickle, but Ben Sanderson had held that specific, tantalizing detail back for a deliberate heartbeat, as if mentally weighing it on a scale, deciding on its value and, more importantly, its safety to reveal. He was not just sharing. He was baiting a hook. I saw Daniel's eyes narrow, just a hair, a minute tightening of the skin at their corners that was the only outward sign of his intense internal focus. The shift was almost imperceptible, but it was there. The languid listening posture was gone, replaced by a coiled, predatory stillness. The hunter, who had been passively observing the forest, had finally caught a scent on the wind, the faint, acrid smell of a lie. What things? Daniel's voice was deceptively soft, a low murmur that seemed to absorb the diner's noise rather than cut through it. It was a tone designed to soothe, to encourage confession without pressure, a tool from his past life that he could still wield with precision. The gentleness of it made the directness of the question even more piercing. The effect on Ben was immediate and visceral. "I don't know," he insisted, his voice cracking as the paper napkin in his grip finally gave way. shredding into a dozen pathetic white scraps that littered the formica like snow. It was a burst of frustration that felt too sharp, too theatrical, a performance of helplessness. She was vague, scared. She just said she'd seen something she shouldn't have. Something in the records, maybe. She said it was handled, but the way she said it didn't feel right. It was settled, but it wasn't settled, you know. He was building a narrative now, layering in just enough tantalizing detail. Records, handled, to sound credible, to point us in a specific direction. That was 2 days ago, he finished, as if providing a crucial timestamp for our investigation. Then his eyes, wide and glistening, darted from Daniel's impassive face to mine, a silent appeal to the softer target. The plea was naked, desperate. "You have to find her, please." And then the clincher, the line that felt rehearsed. "I have money. I can pay." It was the offer of a transaction, an attempt to shift the dynamic from a plea for help to a business arrangement, to make us complicit in a story he was controlling. Daniel was silent for a long, excruciating moment, his gaze a physical weight fixed on Ben Sanderson. He wasn't just listening to the words. He was watching the man's soul, seeing straight through the artfully constructed panic to the cold, shrewd calculation operating beneath. He saw the careful placement of clues, the performance of grief, the attempt to hire us as actors in his play. "We'll look into it," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any promise or comfort. It was the same non-committal, professionally neutral phrase he'd used with Ilara Cruz. But this time, it wasn't a simple statement. It was a trap, baited not with suspicion but with apparent acquiescence. He was accepting the case on the surface, all the while knowing the real investigation would be into the man sitting across from us. The simple words were a door clicking shut, locking Ben into a story he would not get to write. Ben left a little calmer, clutching the cheap card with our number printed in slightly faded ink, a token he probably wouldn't need to use, a prop in a play where he believed he was the director. The moment the door sighed shut behind him, sealing out the weeping rain and his performative despair, the very atmosphere in our booth crackled and changed. Daniel's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The passive listening posture, the granite mask of impartiality, evaporated. It was like watching a predator lower its camouflage. The stillness remained, but it was no longer passive. It was a coil of potential energy, a sharp, predatory focus that seemed to draw all the light and sound in the room toward him. The air itself felt thinner, charged. "He's lying," Daniel stated, his voice cold and flat, devoid of the softness he'd used moments before. It was a clinical pronouncement, a verdict delivered from the bench. He wasn't guessing. He was stating a fact, verified by a lifetime of reading the tells of guilty men. "The grief's real," he conceded, his eyes still fixed on the door as if he could still see the ghost of Ben's departure. "I could smell it on him. It's there, but it's performative. It's a weapon he's wielding, a blanket he's throwing over something else." He finally turned his head, and his gaze was like a shard of ice. "He's hiding something, and he's bad at it." The hesitation, the little glances to see if we were buying it, the way he offered money, it was all a script. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his hands flat on the table. "The wife saw something at the hospital, that part's true. But he knows exactly what it was." He didn't guess, he knew. "And whatever it is, he's not afraid she left because of it. He's afraid of what happens now that she's gone with that knowledge." The hunter had not only caught the scent, he had already identified the prey. My job began. The moment Daniel's form dissolved into the grim, rain-slicked tapestry of the city outside, the atmosphere in the booth shifted from one of interrogation to one of intense, focused excavation. While Daniel hit the streets, a spectre leaning on old contacts in the transit authority and the overworked, cynical precinct that covered the rail lines, trading in favors and unspoken threats in damp alleyways, I dove into the silent, depthless digital world of St. Ignatius Hospital. It was a formidable fortress of bureaucratic red tape and impenetrable HIPAA laws, a labyrinth of firewalls and access protocols designed to repel exactly this kind of inquiry. But I have always found that every fortress, no matter how well guarded, has a ledger. Its financial heartbeat leaves a trail, a ghost in the machine. I followed the money, my fingers flying across the keyboard, navigating through layers of administrative portals and public financial disclosures, cross-referencing grant numbers with departmental allocations. It was a dizzying maze of interconnected departmental budgets and cryptic procurement orders, 1,000 small financial streams feeding into the hospital's central accounts. For hours it was a fruitless search through a desert of legitimate, if depressing, expenditures. But then I found it. A single glaring discrepancy that stood out like a neon sign in a blackout. It was a massive recurring order for a specific class of experimental immunosuppressant drugs, all billed meticulously to the oncology ward. The amount was staggering, not just in its totality but in its consistent volume, a voracious and unchanging appetite that defied all logic. It was far beyond the conceivable needs of even a large terminal patient load. It was the consumption of a small nation. And the supplier was the final damning piece. A shell company with a name so generic it was practically invisible. A corporate ghost with a mailing address that, after some digging, traced back to a boarded-up, condemned storefront in the industrial flats. It was a river of cash, a torrent of hospital funding, flowing steadily and silently into a black hole, all disguised under the benevolent, unquestionable guise of life-saving medicine. The ledger didn't just suggest a problem. It screamed of a systemic hidden hemorrhage. Meanwhile, Daniel's investigation into the train yielded a chilling fact, a piece of ice that froze the entire case solid. The security footage from her specific car, for her specific journey, contained a precise 3-minute and 14-second gap, right around the time the 1022 would have been pulling into the final few stations. It wasn't a glitch, a blur, or a malfunctioning lens. It was a clean digital excision. He learned this from a bitter ex-transit cop, nursing a whiskey in a bar that smelled of defeat. A man whose pension hadn't been enough to wash the grime of the city's compromises from his soul. Over the clink of glass, the man explained it in a low, cynical mutter. It was a scheduled maintenance override, a protocol buried deep in the system's administrative back-end, initiated remotely from a terminal that should have been logged, but wasn't. Someone with high-level access, someone who knew the schedules, the routes, the vulnerabilities in the city's mechanical circulatory system, had not just exploited a blind spot. They had willed one into existence. They had reached into the central nervous system of the transit authority and with a few keystrokes had turned off the unblinking eyes of the city for exactly long enough to make a single, careful woman vanish without a digital trace, a ghost operation that spoke of planning, precision, and a terrifying intimacy with the levers of official power. This cold, technical truth caused Daniel's simmering suspicion of the husband to harden into an absolute, unshakable certainty. He found me late one night in the booth, the diner empty save for Mel wiping down the grill with a weary circular rhythm. Daniel's knuckles were raw and freshly abraded, the skin split over two of them, a silent, violent epilogue to a conversation with a reluctant transit worker who had known more than his job description allowed. "He's not trying to find her," Daniel told me, his voice low and stripped of all doubt. He didn't say her name. She had become a concept now, a prize in a twisted game. "He's herding us, like cattle." He replayed the initial meeting in his mind, each of Ben's words now taking on a new, sinister meaning. He gave us the hospital clue. He dangled it like a piece of bait. He wanted us to look there, to waste our time chasing down pharmaceutical ghosts and bureaucratic cover-ups. He's not a client. He's a director. He's managing the investigation, feeding us just enough truth to make the lie believable, steering us toward a conclusion that ends with her being a tragic runaway or a victim of hospital corruption, anything that keeps us from looking directly at him. The panicked husband was a costume, and we were the audience he was performing for, all while the real play was happening somewhere else in the darkness, off stage. The disparate fragments of the case, the financial phantom, the engineered blind spot on the train, the husband's meticulously flawed performance, suddenly snapped together, locking into a single, horrifying whole with an almost audible click. The narrative reconfigured itself, shedding the skin of a simple missing persons case to reveal the venomous serpent coiled beneath. Sarah Sanderson, the sharp-eyed and principled nurse, had undoubtedly discovered the massive, brazen drug fraud festering within St. Ignatius's walls. She would have seen the orders, recognized the impossible quantities, perhaps even noticed the absence of patients who should have been receiving such expensive, specialized care. Frightened and morally outraged, she would have done what any trusting partner would do. She'd gone straight to her husband, seeking solace, counsel, and a plan to expose the corruption. And he, for reasons that remained shrouded in a darkness we had yet to penetrate, was not her ally. He was already in on it, a participant, a beneficiary, or perhaps even an architect of the scheme. The realization was a physical chill. The man who had wept in our booth, who had twisted a napkin into a symbol of his helplessness, was not a victim. He was the warden. Instead of protecting her, his first instinct had been to contain her. The panicked, grieving husband was a masterfully constructed mask, a persona worn to manipulate and misdirect. His entire presentation, the wrong-buttoned jacket, the frantic eyes, the invocation of her orchid, was a calculated performance designed to elicit sympathy and, more importantly, to control the narrative. He hadn't come to us to find his wife. His mission was far more cynical. He needed to contain the problem she represented, to steer our investigation away from the uncomfortable truth of his own complicity. By handing us the hospital clue, he was attempting to channel our energies into a dead-end search for corporate villains, a safe distance from his own doorstep. Furthermore, his hiring of us served a second, more insidious purpose. It was a reconnaissance mission. By watching us, by listening to our theories, he could ascertain what his wife might have already told others, who else she might have confided in, before he could move her to a permanent silence. He was using us as canaries in a coal mine, hoping our investigation would flutter and die in the toxic gas of his deception before it ever reached the heart of the truth, where he and his wife were trapped. The breakthrough, when it finally arrived, did not emerge from the tangled web of hospital finances or the staged grief of a dishonest husband. It came from a different, darker angle altogether, unearthed by methods I have learned not to inquire about. Daniel, leveraging a network of contacts and skills forged in shadows I've never fully seen, procured a list of all properties leased under the labyrinthine corporate umbrella of the shell company that supplied the phantom drugs. Most were the expected ghosts. Empty lots choked with weeds, virtual offices that existed only as a line of code, post office boxes in strip malls, the flimsy architecture of financial deception. But one entry stood out, a stark anomaly on the sterile spreadsheet. It was a private, stand-alone medical waste incineration facility, squatting on a desolate stretch of industrial waterfront, a place where the city's physical refuse was sent to be purged by fire. On paper, it was legitimate, a necessary if grim piece of municipal infrastructure, but its energy consumption, which I pulled from a separate utility database, told a different, more sinister story. The power draw was colossal, a constant, voracious drain on the grid that was orders of magnitude beyond what a simple incinerator, even a large one, could possibly require. The numbers screamed a truth that defied its mundane purpose. "They're not disposing of waste," I said. My voice low as I stared at the power grid readout, the figures painting a picture of immense hidden activity. The energy signature was that of a data center or a manufacturing plant, not a crematorium for bandages and biohazards. That level of consistent draw, it's for climate control, for banks of servers, for specialized lighting. They're running a lab, a hidden one. The incinerator wasn't their business. It was their camouflage, the perfect cover for a massive illegal power draw and a reason for noxious smells to go unquestioned. We moved instantly. There was no time to call the police, to navigate jurisdictions and warrants, not with a corrupt husband likely monitoring any official chatter and a woman's life hanging in the balance. The incinerator plant materialized out of the industrial gloom like a bunker, a grim, windowless block of stained concrete, its sole smokestack a silent black dagger piercing the belly of the night sky. The place felt abandoned, but the hum in the air and the digital glow of a keypad lock on a reinforced side door betrayed the truth. Daniel approached the door, and with a quiet, focused intensity that was more frightening than any display of force, he bypassed the modern security system with a terrifying, practiced ease that spoke of a past life I could only guess at. The lock disengaged with a soft hydraulic sigh. He pulled the heavy door open, and the atmosphere that rolled out was a palpable wave. It was thick, sterile, and cold, carrying the astringent smell of industrial antiseptic, layered over with something else entirely, something cloyingly sweet and unnervingly chemical, like synthetic fruit rotting under a heat lamp. It was the smell of something that didn't want to be found. We found her deep within the facility's sterile, humming core, in a converted storage room whose original purpose had been utterly perverted. The space was a chilling hybrid of medical bay and prison cell. Harsh, shadowless LED panels cast a clinical glare on stark white walls, but heavy-duty bolts drilled into the concrete floor spoke of recent, brutal modification, anchoring the steel-framed gurney at the room's center. On it, Sarah Sanderson was secured not with simple ropes, but with thick industrial-strength nylon straps that bit into the thin fabric of a hospital gown, pinning her wrists and ankles. An IV stand stood sentinel beside her, its clear plastic line snaking down to a needle taped securely to the inside of her elbow, feeding a colorless, innocuous-looking liquid into her bloodstream. Her skin was waxy and pale, drained of its vitality, and her breathing was a faint, shallow rhythm that barely disturbed the stale air. Yet despite the chemical yoke and her physical confinement, her eyes were wide open. They were the most alive thing in the room. They did not dart in animal panic, but were fixed with a terrifying, lucid intensity on the figure looming over her. They burned with a fierce, defiant intelligence, a raw and unbroken spirit that the drugs and the fear had clouded but could not extinguish. This was not a passive victim awaiting her fate. This was a fighter who had been systematically, professionally subdued, her body betrayed but her will still waging a silent, furious war against her circumstances. And standing over her, his back to us as we entered the soundless room, was Ben Sanderson. The transformation was absolute. The kind, panicked husband from the diner was utterly gone, erased as if he had never existed. This man was a study in cold functionality. He wore disposable latex gloves and a lab coat that was too large for him, its sleeves rolled up precisely. He was wholly focused on the task before him, his movements economical and practiced. In his gloved hands, he held a large syringe, its barrel filled with a viscous, opaque, milky substance that seemed to swallow the light. He was tapping the side of it with a fingernail, checking for bubbles with a detached professional air that was more horrifying than any overt display of cruelty. As he half-turned at the slight sound of our entry, his face was revealed not in a flash of startled guilt, but in a slow, resigned acknowledgement. It was a cold mask, its features set in lines of profound weariness and an almost philosophical acceptance. There was no malice in his expression, no gleeful sadism. Instead, there was only a grim, terrible necessity, a bleak finality that suggested he was performing a distasteful but unavoidable duty, like putting down a sick animal. This was the core of the man, stripped of its performative grief, a hollowed-out instrument of a terrible decision, convinced there was no other path forward. The ordinariness of his resolve was the most monstrous thing of all. "Stop right there, Dylan," Ben said, his voice unnervingly steady now, a flat, calibrated instrument, stripped of all its previous tremors and performative cracks. All pretense, the carefully constructed facade of the distraught husband had evaporated, leaving behind the chillingly pragmatic core of the man. He didn't even look surprised by our intrusion. His reaction was one of weary acknowledgement, as if we were a complicating variable in a complex equation he had already calculated, a delayed but expected interruption in a grimly inevitable process. He didn't raise the syringe like a weapon. He simply held it, his thumb resting against the plunger, a man poised to complete a dreaded but necessary task. "I don't understand the architecture of this," he continued, his gaze locking with Daniel's, bypassing me entirely. In that moment, the room felt like a sealed chamber containing only the three of them, the hunter, the traitor, and the prize on the gurney. This operation, this entire flow of capital and resources, it's a self-sustaining ecosystem. It's bigger than her life. It's bigger than my conscience. It's bigger than me. He stated it not as a boast, but as a simple, tragic fact of a world he believed he had no power to change, only to navigate for his own desperate ends. "It always is," Daniel said, the words a low, gravelly pronouncement that carried the weight of 1,000 similar justifications he'd heard from 1,000 guilty men. His own gun was already drawn and aimed, a dark and steady extension of his will, its barrel unwavering. He hadn't made a grand gesture of it. It had simply appeared in his hand, a tool brought to bear with lethal efficiency. The room was instantly frozen, crystallized into a perfect, terrible standoff. It wasn't a clash of opposites, but a dark mirror, two men who, in that suspended moment, understood the other's position with perfect, horrifying clarity. One was fighting to save a life based on principle, the other to save a life based on a corrupted, desperate love. Both believed their path was the only one. The money, Ben said, and a flicker of his former persona, the pleading, desperate man from the diner, briefly animated his features, a ghost of his mask returning not as deception, but as a glimpse of the torment that underpinned his resolve. "You have to see that. It wasn't for a new car, a vacation, not for me. It was for our daughter, Elise. She's 8. She has a rare autoimmune disorder, something so niche the research is barely funded. The treatment that could actually help her. It's not approved here. It's still in trials overseas. It costs a fortune just to get her into the program, let alone sustain it. All of this, he gestured vaguely with his free hand, encompassing the hidden lab, the fraud, the woman on the table. This was the only way to generate that kind of capital. The only way. So you let them experiment on people to pay for it? Daniel's voice was like ice, sharp and unforgiving, cutting through the emotional appeal to the monstrous core of the transaction. He didn't shout. The quiet, dispassionate tone made the accusation even more damning. "They're terminal anyway," Ben shouted back, the syringe trembling slightly in his gloved hand, his composure finally fracturing under the weight of the judgment in Daniel's voice. The clinical detachment vanished, replaced by a raw defensive fervor. "The patients in the trial, the ones receiving the bulk of the drugs, they have no other options left. The medications, they're not what you think. They are part of the trial, but a parallel, unregulated one. A high-risk, high-reward branch. The ones who don't make it, their records are scrubbed. The unused supplies are written off, diverted back into the funding stream. It's a closed loop. No one was ever supposed to know." His eyes, wide and pleading, flicked to his wife, and for a single unguarded second a look of pure, unadulterated agony was there, the authentic pain of a man who loved the woman he was about to destroy. She wasn't supposed to know. Guy told her to drop it, to just look the other way. But she's a nurse. She took the oath seriously. She couldn't just unsee it. The truth was finally out. A confession that was both an explanation and a life sentence. It was a confession that laid bare the entire, rotten architecture of his damnation, a raw exposition of motive that explained everything and excused absolutely nothing. He had meticulously detailed the monstrous calculus of his choice, presenting a ledger where the life of his daughter was balanced against not only his own morality, but the very life of the woman he had sworn to love and protect. He had sold his soul on the installment plan, trading slivers of his integrity for vials of experimental medicine, until finally the ultimate payment came due. His wife's silence, her freedom, and very nearly her life. He had become the jailer of the person he cherished most to preserve the existence of another, a perverse and tragic inversion of love that had curdled into a form of psychological torture for himself and a death sentence for her. The weight of this understanding, that he had committed an unforgivable act for what he believed was an unforgivable reason, hung in the sterile air, a poison more potent than anything in the syringe. Daniel didn't negotiate. He didn't offer platitudes or attempt to reason with the unreasonable. He understood that at this precipice, words were worthless currency. He only dealt in actions, in the immutable language of presence and consequence. He moved. It was not a lunge, not a threat of violence, but a single, sharp and deliberate step forward. The shift in his stance was minimal, yet it was seismic. It was the physical manifestation of an ultimatum, an encroachment into Ben's space that shattered the fragile standoff. His gun remained leveled, but it was his will, focused and absolute, that was the true weapon. "Put the needle down, Ben." His voice was low, a controlled vibration that brooked no argument, a force of nature speaking. "It's over." The sentence was not a prediction or a hope. It was a declaration of fact. He was not announcing the end of the confrontation. He was announcing the end of Ben's chosen path. The road the man had been walking, paved with terrible compromises and culminating in this sterile room, had just reached a cliff face. There was no more forward. There was only surrender or annihilation. The moment stretched, taut as a wire humming with a lethal current, a suspended fragment of eternity where the entire universe seemed to hold its breath. The only sounds were the faint hum of the facility, and Sarah's shallow, drugged breathing from the gurney. I could see the war raging behind Ben's eyes, the last frantic calculations of a mind trying to find an exit that didn't exist, the desperate hope for a third option evaporating under the cold, unblinking reality of Daniel's resolve. Then the wire snapped. A sound escaped Ben's lips, a strangled, wet sob that was less a cry of emotion, and more the death rattle of his resistance, the final, catastrophic collapse of his terrible purpose. His fingers, which had been so precise and clinical around the syringe, simply unlocked. The instrument of death slipped from his grasp, hitting the hard concrete floor with a sharp plastic clatter that echoed grotesquely in the quiet room. It rolled erratically, a spinning, shiny thing coming to rest in a pool of shadows beneath a counter, its milky contents glinting faintly. The fight, the lies, the desperate performance, all of it drained from him at once. His legs buckled, not in a faint, but in a total abdication of strength, and he collapsed into a nearby metal chair as if his skeleton had been removed. He folded forward, his face buried deep in his hands, his shoulders curling inward as his entire body was racked with violent, silent tremors. He was not crying for mercy. He was shaking with the colossal, unbearable weight of what he had done, and what he had, in this final moment of surrender, irrevocably lost. He was finally feeling the full cost of the deal he had made, and it was crushing him into dust. Daniel was at Sarah's side in an instant, a blur of motion that was both urgent and intensely focused. The world, the sobbing husband, the chilling confession, the sterile horror of the room narrowed to a single point: the woman on the gurney. With a swift, sure motion, he tore the IV needle from her arm, discarding the plastic line like a venomous serpent. The act was not one of medical precision, but of primal liberation, a severing of the physical tether that bound her to the nightmare. As the connection broke, her eyes, which had been fixed on him with a desperate, lucid intensity, fluttered for a second, then locked onto his with a new, profound depth. In that glance, in the silent space between one ragged breath and the next, something intangible and potent passed between them. It was a current that bypassed words, a resonance that went far beyond the simple gratitude of a rescued victim. It was a recognition, immediate and absolute, as if two tuning forks, long dormant and forged in different fires, had been struck and discovered they shared the exact same frequency of loss. Daniel saw in her gaze not just fear, but a familiar, hard-won fortitude, the unbroken spirit of someone who had looked into the abyss of human betrayal, not from a distance, but from the intimacy of her own marriage bed, and had refused to blink. She in turn saw in his grim, weathered face not just a savior, but a fellow traveler. On a road paved with anguish, she saw the ghosts that haunted his eyes, the weight of a past tragedy that had sculpted him into this instrument of fierce, relentless protection. They recognized in each other the specific isolating loneliness of being a good person, a dedicated nurse, a seeker of justice caught and brutalized by a monstrous, impersonal machine. Whether it was a corrupt corporate entity or the random, brutal machinery of fate, this silent communion held a charge that was undeniably, potently personal. It was the spark of a connection that could, under different circumstances, easily kindle into something more. There was a protectiveness in Daniel's touch that felt different, a vulnerability in her gaze that was offered to him alone. The potential for a romantic bond was there, hovering in the air between them, a shared vulnerability so profound it could be the foundation of a deep intimacy. But for now it remained just that, a potential, a seed planted in the barren soil of trauma, its future growth uncertain. What flourished in that moment was something perhaps more critical, an unshakable alliance, a mutual understanding that they were, from this point forward, bound by this shared experience of darkness and deliverance. His hands, which could be so brutally efficient with a lockpick or a hostile informant, now worked with a surprising, meticulous gentleness on the thick straps that bound her. His fingers, calloused and capable, were careful not to brush against the raw, abraded skin on her wrists, his touch mindful and respectful as he unbuckled the nylon restraints that had held her captive. Each release of a clasp was a small victory, a silent promise of safety being slowly, physically restored. He wasn't just freeing a client. He was performing an act of reverence for a resilience that mirrored his own, for a pain he understood better than anyone. He was untethering a kindred spirit from the evidence of her betrayal, and in doing so, he was unconsciously beginning the process of tethering her to himself. We got her out of there, a frantic, silent exodus from that sterile tomb. The journey back through the labyrinth of concrete corridors felt both an eternity and a single, breathless moment, with Daniel half carrying a stumbling, disoriented Sarah between us, her weight a testament to her ordeal and our purpose. We emerged into the damp, diesel-scented air of the waterfront, the night sky feeling like a vast, forgiving blanket after the claustrophobic glare of the hidden lab. We didn't wait for fanfare or explanation. We deposited her into the care of a discreet private clinic we sometimes used, a place that asked no questions and understood the need for vanished identities. She was registered under a name that had no history, a ghost in the system, finally safe from the machinations that had ensnared her. Only then, from a payphone in the dead of night, did the anonymous tip be made, a garbled message to the authorities that would lead them to the incinerator facility. When they arrived, sirens cutting through the industrial silence, they would find a scene laid bare for them, a broken man, hollowed out by his own confession, waiting amidst the evidence of his crime, his story spilling out in a monotone of defeat. The scandal at St. Ignatius would be massive, a seismic shockwave that would ripple through the city's medical community, toppling administrators and triggering a dozen other investigations. But that was a future tempest for other people to weather. But for us, the case was closed. Our work ended not with a verdict, but with a delivery. Back in the familiar, grimy embrace of our booth at Mel's, the world outside the rain-streaked window had settled. The storm that had wept for days had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a city that glistened under the weak, peach-gray light of a hesitant dawn. The air in the diner was thick with the smell of percolating coffee and frying bacon, the mundane symphony of a new day beginning, utterly indifferent to the nocturnal drama that had just concluded. Sarah Sanderson was no longer a name on our minds, but a person in recovery, sheltered behind layers of security and anonymity, beginning the long, internal journey of healing from a betrayal that had cut deeper than any physical wound. Daniel was quiet, but it was a different quiet. It wasn't the hollow silence of his grief, that vast and empty expanse I had grown accustomed to, nor was it the focused, predatory stillness that came over him during a hunt. This was a contemplative, almost pensive stillness. He stared into his fresh coffee, but he wasn't seeing ghosts in the dark liquid. He seemed to be looking at something else, something reflected from within. The storm of the case had passed, but instead of leaving the familiar devastation in its wake, it had deposited something new, something unexpected on the shore of his being. There was a subtle loosening in the set of his shoulders, a slight, almost imperceptible light in the depths of his eyes that had nothing to do with the dawn outside. It was as if in confronting the absolute corruption of Ben Sanderson's love, he had been forced to reaffirm the existence of its pure, unadulterated counterpart. In saving Sarah, he hadn't just solved a puzzle or balanced a scale. He had connected with a resilience that mirrored his own, and in that connection, a single small shard of the ice that had encased his heart for 2 years had quietly and irrevocably begun to thaw. The case was closed, but a new, more fragile and uncertain story had just whispered its first word. He loved his daughter, I said, the words feeling inadequate the moment they left my lips. I was trying, as I always do, to make the numbers of the human equation balance, to find a logical through line between the motive and the monstrous crime. So I sought a formula where profound love could be factored against unforgivable betrayal, a desperate attempt to force the chaos of human failing into the clean columns of a ledger. But they never do. The sums always come out wrong, the decimals forever bleeding into a remainder of pure anguish that can never be reconciled. Love isn't a blanket excuse. "Michael," Daniel replied, his voice quiet but firm, a scalpel neatly severing my attempt at moral accounting. There was no anger in his tone, only a weary absolute certainty forged in a personal fire I knew all too well. It's a motive. Just like greed or fear or pride. It's a reason, not an absolution. He turned his gaze from me, looking out the window where the city was beginning to dry, the pavement steaming faintly as the rising sun burned away the last vestiges of the storm. He stood at a crossroads and he made a choice, a conscious, deliberate choice. He didn't just fail to protect his wife, he actively chose one life over hers. He traded her future to secure his daughter's, and in doing so, he forfeited any claim to his own soul. His profile was stark against the glass, a man who understood the terrible weight of choices and their irreversible consequences. "She saw it," he said almost to himself, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "In that room, tied down, she looked at him, and she didn't see the man she loved." She saw the architect of her nightmare. She knew exactly what he'd become. He wasn't just talking about the man with the syringe. He was describing the moment a universe of shared trust collapses into a single terrible truth. The phone rang. Its shrill, mechanical jangle was a familiar sound. Yet in the quiet aftermath of the storm, it felt more invasive, more demanding than ever before. It was another shrill, desperate sound, cutting through the diner's fragile peace, a stark reminder that our booth was not a sanctuary, but a magnet for the city's broken and lost. Each ring was a needle stitching us back into the fabric of a world that never stopped needing, never stopped hurting. Daniel didn't look at it. He didn't flinch or tense. His eyes remained fixed on me, and in that look I saw the entire journey of the last 2 years reflected and transformed. I saw the raw, bottomless grief that had once hollowed him out, now integrated into his being, like a foundational stratum of rock. I saw the hardened purpose he had rediscovered in the hunt for Emily Atticus and Leo Cruz, a purpose that had given him a reason to move forward. But now, layered over it all, I saw something new, a weary, profound acceptance. It was the look of a man who had peered into the abyss, not just of human cruelty, but of cosmic indifference, of realities layered upon realities, and had not looked away. He had accepted that the world was far stranger, darker, and more incomprehensible than either of us had ever imagined, and that our role was not to understand it, but to stand at its edge and occasionally push back whatever tried to slither through. He gave a slow, final nod. It was not a gesture of enthusiasm or determination. It was an acknowledgement, a confirmation of the pact we had made, of the path we were now on. It was the closing of one case and the immutable opening of another. It was the only answer the phone would ever get from him. The receiver felt heavy in my hand, cold against my palm. I picked up the phone. "Dillon Investigations," I said, my voice assuming its professional, calming tone. A practiced filter for the panic that was undoubtedly on the other end. But I knew, even as I listened to the next desperate, trembling voice spill its story of another vanished loved one, another inexplicable horror, that this particular story, the story of Ben and Sarah Sanderson, wasn't over. We had closed the file, but the narrative had splintered, and a new character had been irrevocably introduced. Sarah Sanderson had stared into the heart of darkness, not in a shadowy alley or a corporate lab, but in the eyes of her own husband across the breakfast table. She had seen the ultimate betrayal festering in her own home, had felt its straps on her wrists and its needle in her vein, and she had survived it with a clarity and defiance that was nothing short of breathtaking. She possessed a resilience that was not born of naivety, but forged in the crucible of that intimate horror, a strength that Daniel had recognized instantly because it was a tempered, quieter version of his own. She was a fighter not with fists or weapons, but with spirit and an unbreakable will. And in our grim world of echoes and anomalies, of palimpsests and impossible shadows, genuine fighters are the rarest currency of all. They are not simply assets. They are a necessary ballast against the overwhelming tide of despair. She was going to be part of the story now. I could feel it with a certainty that went beyond deduction, a deep instinctual knowledge that the threads of her life were now inextricably woven into the frayed tapestry of ours. Her journey was not toward a quiet recovery and a forgotten past. It was on a collision course with the relentless, grinding machinery of the strange and uncanny that seemed to seek out Daniel Dillon. And for the first time in a very long time, as I scribbled down an address for a new misery, the thought of someone new entering our orbit didn't fill me with a sense of protective dread. Instead, it sparked a faint, unfamiliar, and cautiously guarded ember of something else entirely, a fragile, tentative hope.